Well, good evening once again.
Good evening.
It's wonderful to see you all. This is our fourth in the series of intelligent design lectures and videos to accompany them. So we welcome you back once again. Next week will be the last week, as I understand it. So there will be a total of 5. And I'm going to be sorry to see the series end. I'm enjoying this thoroughly, and I hope you are too. I guess you are, because you keep coming back. And I'm glad of that. But let's begin with a prayer, and then we'll turn things over to Professor Sewell. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Lord God, again, we give you thanks that you have brought us together, and we ask that you impart your wisdom to us all. Wisdom about your creation, wisdom about your mighty hand and all that you have done and are still doing among us. So, Lord God, open our hearts, open our minds, open our souls to hear of your glory in all that Dr. Sewell has discovered and will impart to us this evening. And we ask your blessings upon him as well. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. And with that, here's Professor Sewell.
Okay, well, last time we looked at the first part of my video, Why Evolution is Different. And today we're going to look at the second part, and they're kind of 2 separate videos in one, sort of. The first talks about Lecont's axiom. That is the idea that everything has to have a natural cause, and that's a very productive and useful axiom. It's proven very useful in science, but I tried to show why evolution is different. Because basically, if you don't believe in intelligent design, if you believe that the basic forces, the electromagnetic, gravitational, strong and weak nuclear forces are the only forces known. If those are probably clever enough to explain everything that's happened on other planets, but I don't believe they're clever enough to explain what's happened here. And anyway, the second part of the video starts out by asking, why is Darwinism still so popular when it's so implausible? And it really is implausible, and it becomes more implausible with every biological and biochemical discovery. It becomes more unreasonable, and yet it remains popular. Why? And I give 2 reasons. One is Lecont's axiom, which we just talked about in the last part of the video. And the other is the one that's going to be talked about in the second part of the video, and that's the similarities between species. We are similar to the apes. Within a given genus, there are species that are pretty similar. And it seems reasonable to think that it was natural causes that got from one species to the next. So those are the two reasons. I'm going to basically give you a kind of a preview of the video, then I'm going to show it, and then we're going to get to more philosophical discussion. But first, let me tell you what to look for here. So the video first the second part of the video brings out the structure of the fossil record, that there are large gaps where major new features appear, that is orders, classes, and phyla, and smaller gaps where less major new features appear, that would be families, genera, and species. And Darwin and Darwinists today still insist that it had to be gradual, because otherwise there's no natural explanation. So it's assumed, in spite of the evidence, that the transition from one phyla to the next must have been gradual. But the problem is not just the fossil record. That's one of the main points of this second part of the video. That you could maybe believe that the difference between phyla, or the differences between classes within a phylum and so forth, maybe those could have been bridged gradually, but the problem is that's not the only problem. The fossil record's not the only reason to believe that the gaps are real, the large gaps are real. We'll see. Gaylord Simpson summarizes the fossil record, and then Jean Rostand is going to talk about how difficult it is to explain the differences between major groups. And he's not talking about the fossil record. He's talking about the fact that gradual transitions wouldn't make any sense. And I want to give an example in a minute of to show you why the major changes couldn't have occurred gradually, because the intermediate stages would have been useless. And well, it could have gradually, but Darwinism couldn't explain it, certainly. Darwinism is based on small improvements. And first I want to go to a article by David Klinghoffer that's linked. By the way, I just added this link here. So if you haven't downloaded the study guide, you might want to download it again. But here's an article by David Kincaid that's discussing an article in the British newspaper, The Guardian. And it's called, "Do We Need a New Theory of Evolution?" And he quotes from, well, let me just go to the actual Guardian article here, and I'll read the first few paragraphs. But the point is that in the first part of the video, we quoted from Lecont's book in 1888 and a 1980 meeting, which acknowledged both problems, basically acknowledged the fact that the differences between the major groups, between classes and orders, and especially phyla, are not only large in the fossil record, but it's more than just the fossil record. It's the intermediate stages wouldn't have made any sense. And just to show you that hasn't changed since 1980, I could give you a bunch of other quotes, but here's an article in The Guardian. Here we go. This is just last year. And it's by a reporter who basically interviewed a bunch of evolutionary biologists. And I'll just read the first three paragraphs here. "Strange as it sounds, scientists still do not know the answers to some of the most basic questions about how life on Earth evolved. Take eyes, for example. Where did they come from exactly? The usual explanation of how we got these stupendously complex organs rests upon the theory of natural selection. You may recall the gist from high school biology lessons. If a creature with poor eyesight happens to produce offspring with slightly better eyesight, thanks to random mutations, then that tiny bit gives more vision, gives them a chance of survival." I'll skip a little bit of this, but eventually, after a few 100 million years, you have creatures that see as well as humans, cats, or owls. This is the basic story of evolution as recounted in countless textbooks and pop science bestsellers. The problem, according to a growing number of scientists, is that it's absurdly crude and misleading. For one thing, it starts midway through the story, taking for granted the existence of light-sensitive cells, lenses, and irises without explaining where they came from in the first place. Nor does it adequately explain how such delicate and easily disrupted components mesh together to form a single organ. And it isn't just eyes that the traditional theory struggles with. The first eye, the first wing, the first placenta, how they emerge. Explaining these is the foundational motivation of evolutionary biology, says Armin Motzek, a biologist at Indiana University, and yet we still do not have a good answer. The classic idea of gradual change, one happy accident at a time, has so far fallen flat. So that's something you don't hear in your biology textbooks, but you will if you, in fact, Klinghoffer talks about how this is kind of a trade secret, that natural selection is implausible, even to evolutionary biologists, but they don't normally admit it to the public. Okay, so I just, that's a new link that I just added right above 4B, if you want to read the details. But it illustrates the fact that the objections that we raised in the first part of the video are still valid. The classic idea of gradual change, one happy accident at a time, one mutation at a time, has so far fallen flat. Okay, now I've got an example here. I'm still talking about the video that's coming up, but I'll show it in a few minutes. But I want to show you an example that illustrates real clearly what we're talking about here. And it's taken from an article, the Life Sciences Encyclopedia, we're going to quote from in the end of the video, on carnivorous plants, Wolf Eckert Linisch, who spent 25 years in the Max Planck Institute of Plant Breeding Research in Cologne, Germany. I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of times in Germany. It's just an article about carnivorous plants, but it has some interesting comments about the origin of carnivorous plants. In particular, well, one thing they say is it appears to be hard to even imagine down here, hard to even imagine clear-cut selective advantages for all the thousands of postulated intermediate stages in a gradual scenario. In other words, it's hard to imagine how these traps, any of them, could have evolved gradually. And presumably they don't evolve gradually in the fossil record. And to see why, let's look at one of them. I've got a nice diagram. This will actually show up in the video. This is a diagram of an aquatic bladderwort. Let me read a little. I've got a description of it in my book here as an example of what's called irreducible complexity. In other words, it doesn't make any sense for this to evolve gradually. And here's a description of this plant in a 1947 book, Plants and Environment. The aquatic bladderworts are delicate herbs that bear bladder-like traps 5 millimeters or less in diameter. These traps have trigger hairs attached to the valve-like door, which normally keeps the trap tightly closed. The sides of the trap are compressed under tension, but when a small form of animal life touches one of the trigger hairs, the valve opens, the bladder suddenly expands, and the animal is sucked into the trap. The door closes at once, and in about 20 minutes, the trap is set ready for another victim. And the point is, that's impossible to imagine that evolving gradually. First place, it's a vacuum. Well, it expands rapidly when animal. It's in the water. This is not airtight. It's a watertight trap. But small form of animal life touches the trigger hair. The door opens and the bladder expands suddenly, sucking the victim into the trap. And it's got to be completely watertight before it's any use whatever. And furthermore, not only does the trigger hairs and the valve-like door and the walls have to be there without any breaks in them, but another scientist in 1959 talks about this and says, even a perfect suction trap displaying the astonishing ability to rapidly catch animals would have no advantage in the struggle for life because the prey would not be digested. Conversely, the production of highly effective digestive juices would be of no avail for the tip of a leaf as long as it could not capture the prey, which is absolutely necessary. But even if the suction trap and digestive juices cooperated, nothing would be gained in the struggle for life. The dissolved proteins must also be absorbed and metabolized to species-specific proteins. The formation of the suction trap requires the perfect cooperation of many different genes and developmental factors. At the end, a benefit is reached in the struggle for life, but not by any evolutionary stage. Knockway concluded that none of the contemporary evolutionary theories was able to answer these questions, proposing that the answer might lie outside the present scientific paradigms. In other words, design, but he doesn't want to say that. And anyway, these two Max Planck biologists are quoting him and talking about it. And in fact, on the second page, it mentions something interesting. It says that recent discoveries that the well-being of this bladderwort appears to be largely independent of its prey. In other words, it doesn't really need the trap to begin with to survive. It's doing just fine as a plant. Other plants don't eat meat. It just has a trap for fun, basically. So, this is kind of an example. Not only does the trap have to work with the trigger hair and the valve-like door, but it's got to be able to digest the prey. And until it can digest the prey, it doesn't do any good to trap it, and because plants aren't designed to eat meat. So this is an example that will be discussed real briefly at the end of the video. And so you see that I don't know anything about the fossil record, or if there is a fossil record for this, but presumably, I'm not even sure if this is a new order or new family or what, but I think it's a new order. But it appears, new orders appear consistently suddenly. And if you look at this example, you can see why they wouldn't make any sense to evolve gradually. If they did evolve gradually, they wouldn't be useful until everything's in place. This is an example of a nice example of irreducible complexity. In fact, ironically, Michael Behe talks about, often gives an example of a mousetrap as an example of irreducible complexity. You have to have all the components for it's any good. And I wrote a post once that said in Evolution News that Behe's mousetrap exists in nature. In fact, there's a lot of them. So they're going to be talking about carnivorous plants here, but it's a nice example. And they're everywhere in Behe claims, and so do lots of other microbiologists, biochemists, that there are all sorts of complicated machines in the cell that don't make any sense. Little by little, they have to appear suddenly. Okay, so basically that's what the structure of the fossil record looks like. There's, you look at different species within a genus and you might say, well, it doesn't seem unreasonable that one could evolve from the other, but then you go up to orders and classes and phyla, and there's huge big gaps, and they, complete different body plans. So it's, anyway, so there's really two problems, and we've already talked about those in the first part of the video. Here's further confirmation. So, but the interesting thing is that it's not gradual, and it's step by step. The development of life was not all of a sudden. It really wasn't in 7 days, and it didn't. But it didn't occur gradually. So what does it look like? Well, it looks an awful lot like the way we create things. That's the interesting thing. If you look at human technology, and the video brings this out, this is exactly the way we create things. And before you think I'm offending God, we'll talk about that later. That's just one theory. But the fact is, it does look very much like human technology, and with obvious similarities between each new invention and previous designs, but large jumps where major new features appear for the same reasons. Intermediate steps are useless. And I give an example of transition from steam engines to internal combustion engines. It just makes no sense whatever for that to be gradual, because, you could do it gradually, but the intermediate stages would be useless. So the fact is, it looks a lot like the way we create things. But now there's another point that's made at the end of the video, the last part of the video, talking about something called convergence, which is basically similarities developed independently without a common ancestor with that trait. And it gives an example of bats and dolphins. They're actually both mammals, but they're distantly related. Obviously, one's in the ocean and one's in the cave. But they both developed echolocation, and that isn't evidence of common descent. That's evidence of common design, because they didn't either one get it from a common ancestor. And this convergence happens all the time. That's not one isolated example. This Living Waters video has several examples. The video is going to talk about the convergence in carnivorous plants. A lot of carnivorous plants develop carnivory independently. And that is, those are similarities, but that doesn't fit with evolutionary theory. That fits more with design. And one of the most interesting things is an article recently by Casey Luskin of Discovery Institute, and let me show you that. It's basically showing that genetic convergence is also the case. There's all sorts of things about evolution and design that you would never know if you read the newspaper. That's why I strongly recommend evolutionnews.org. But here's not .org. Casey, it's a recent article that talks about, Richard Dawkins is a famous evolutionary biologist who's very anti-design atheist. And in 2009, and maybe a couple other times, he made the argument that said one of the strongest arguments for evolution is that every gene in a group of organisms will give approximately the same tree of life. If ID is correct, on the other hand, Luskin is, quote, here's the actual quote, but Luskin is summarizing what he's saying, that the test that Dawkins has formulated goes this way. If he says that if Darwinian evolution is correct, every gene in a group of organisms will give approximately the same tree of life. If the idea is correct, on the other hand, the designer could have picked and chosen the best proteins for the job in each organism. In that case, he says, genes would not all give the same tree of genetic resemblances. And I guess at the time he thought that you get approximately the same tree of life no matter what genes you look at. And Luskin shows that simply isn't true. And he quotes a number of experts. And let's see, in particular, he says, now years later, scientists have sequenced a great number of whole genomes. As a consequence, they know that Dawkins was wrong. Every gene does not deliver approximately the same tree of life. In other words, we may be similar to chimpanzees in certain genes, in a lot of genes, but we may be more similar to some other mammal. Basically, it's convergence. He did pick and choose. God did pick and choose the best traits. And yet there's still an approximate tree. In other words, that doesn't mean that, we're clearly, we clearly fit into we're primates, but yet, certain genes, certain traits may be more similar to other animals that aren't primates at all. And so basically the conclusion is that, in fact, the title of this is also linked from the study guide. Intelligent design passes the Dawkins test, and it's highly documented here, and I've heard this from other people too, that basically there's an approximate tree of life to a certain extent, but it's not nearly as tree-like as you'd expect. So basically the designer did pick and choose. We already saw that with the convergence from the, physical traits, but it's true genetically also. And that can't be explained by, evolution, by natural causes. That's a point for design. Okay, now I guess I'm ready to show the video, the second half of the video. We already saw the first half.
How did such an implausible theory as Darwinism ever get to be so popular? There are two reasons: Leconte's axiom and the similarities between species, which suggest common descent. In many people's minds, these similarities not only prove common descent, they prove that evolution was the result of entirely natural processes, even in the absence of any evidence that natural selection can explain the major steps of evolution. But the similarities do not really tell us anything about the causes of evolution. And there is an alternate explanation for these similarities. Harvard paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson writes,
"It is a feature of the known fossil record that most taxa appear abruptly. They are not, as a rule, led up to by a sequence of almost imperceptibly changing forerunners, such as Darwin believed should be usual in evolution. This phenomenon becomes more universal and more intense as the hierarchy of categories is ascended. Gaps among known species are sporadic and often small. Gaps among known orders, classes, and phyla are systematic and almost always large. These peculiarities of the record pose one of the most important theoretical problems in the whole history of life. Is the sudden appearance of higher categories a phenomenon of evolution or of the record only, due to sampling bias and other inadequacies?"
French biologist Jean Rostand wrote,
"It does not seem strictly impossible that mutations should have introduced into the animal kingdom the differences which exist between one species and the next. Hence, it is very tempting to lay also at their door the differences between classes, families, and orders, and in short, the whole of evolution. But it is obvious that such an extrapolation involves the gratuitous attributions to the mutations of the past of a magnitude and power of innovation much greater than is shown by those of today.
In a 2000 Mathematical Intelligencer article entitled A Mathematician's View of Evolution, Granville Sewell wrote the following.
If archaeologists of some future society were to unearth the many versions of my PDE solver which I have produced over the last 20 years, they would certainly note a steady increase in complexity over time, and they would see many obvious similarities between each new version and the previous one. In the beginning, it was only able to solve a single linear steady-state 2D equation in a polygonal region. Since then, PDE-2D has developed many new abilities. It now solves nonlinear problems, time-dependent and eigenvalue problems, systems of simultaneous equations, and it now handles general curved 2D regions. An archaeologist attempting to explain the evolution of this computer program in terms of many tiny improvements might be puzzled to find that each of these major advances, new classes or phyla, appeared suddenly in new versions. For example, the ability to solve 3D problems first appeared in version 4.0. Less major improvements, new families or orders, appeared suddenly in new subversions. For example, the ability to solve 3D problems with periodic boundary conditions first appeared in version 5.6. In fact, the record of PDE-2D's development would be similar to the fossil record, with large gaps where major new features appeared and smaller gaps where minor ones appeared. That is because the multitude of intermediate programs between versions or subversions which the archaeologist might expect to find never existed because, for example, none of the changes I made for edition 4.0 made any sense or provided PDE-2D any advantage whatever in solving 3D problems or anything else until hundreds of lines had been added.
To our modern minds, the similarities between species may suggest natural causes. The argument is basically, this doesn't look like the way God would have created things, an argument used frequently by Darwin in Origin of Species. But if the history of life does not give the appearance of creation by magic wand, it does look very much like the way we humans create things, through testing and improvements. In fact, the fossil record does not even support the idea that new organs and new systems of organs arose gradually. New orders, classes, and phyla consistently appear suddenly. We see this same pattern of large gaps where major new features appear in the history of human technology. For example, if some future paleontologist were to unearth two species of Volkswagens, he might find it plausible that one evolved gradually from the other. He might find the lack of gradual transitions between automobile families more problematic, for example, in the transition from mechanical to hydraulic brake systems, or from manual to automatic transmissions, or from steam engines to internal combustion engines. But if he thought about what gradual transitions would look like, he would understand why they didn't exist. There is no way to transition gradually from a steam engine to an internal combustion engine, for example, without the development of new, but not yet useful, features. He would be even more puzzled by the huge differences between the bicycle and motor vehicle phyla, or between the boat and airplane phyla. But heaven help us, when he uncovers motorcycles and hovercraft, the discovery of these missing links would be hailed in all our newspapers as final proof that all forms of transportation arose gradually from a common ancestor, without design. Some people say, of course cars cannot evolve because they cannot reproduce. Well, designing any type of self-replicating machine is still far beyond our current technology. When we add technology to such a machine to get closer to the goal of reproduction, we only move the goalposts because now we have a more complicated machine to reproduce. So how could we imagine that such a machine could have arisen by pure chance? Nevertheless, imagine that we did manage to construct a fleet of cars that contained completely automated car-building factories inside, with the ability to construct new cars, and not just normal new cars, but new cars containing automated car-building factories inside them. If we left these cars alone and let them reproduce themselves for many generations, is there any chance we would eventually see major advances arise through natural selection of the resulting duplication errors? Of course not. We could confidently predict that the whole process would grind to a halt after a few generations without intelligent humans around to fix the mechanical problems that would inevitably arise, long before we saw duplication errors, which held any promise of advances. Devolution is natural. Evolution is not. That it seems even superficially plausible that random mutations could produce major improvements relies completely on the observed but inexplicable fact that while they are awaiting rare, favorable mutations, living species are able to preserve their complex structures and pass them on to their descendants without significant degradation, generation after generation. We are so used to seeing this happen that we don't appreciate how astonishing it really is. But if we saw cars reproducing themselves, generation after generation, we might conclude that this actually made the development of cars even more difficult to explain without design. The similarities between the history of life and the history of technology go even deeper. Although the similarities between species in the same branch of the evolutionary tree may suggest common descent, similarities also frequently arise independently in distant branches where they cannot be explained by common descent. For example, in their Nature Encyclopedia of Life Sciences article on carnivorous plants, Wolf Eckerd Lenig and Heinz Albert Becker note that
carnivory in plants must have arisen several times independently of each other. The pitchers may have arisen 7 times separately, adhesive traps at least 4 times, snap traps 2 times, and suction traps possibly also 2 times. The independent origin of complex, synorganized structures, which are often anatomically and physiologically very similar to each other, appears to be intrinsically unlikely to many authors, so that they have tried to avoid the hypothesis of convergence as far as possible.
these carnivorous traps, by the way, are all good examples of irreducible complexity. Many features must work together almost perfectly before they can catch and digest victims. Convergence suggests common design rather than common descent. The probability of similar designs arising independently through random processes is very small, but a designer could, of course, take a good design and apply it several times in different places to distantly related species. For example, to give bats and dolphins echolocation abilities. Convergence is a phenomenon often seen in the development of human technology. For example, Ford automobiles and Boeing jets may simultaneously evolve similar new GPS systems. The history of life on Earth appears strikingly similar to the way humans design things, through careful planning, testing, and improvements. As intelligent designers ourselves, we should recognize it when we see this in nature.
Okay, so from a purely scientific point of view, it seems like the way life developed or evolved is basically very strongly suggests design rather than natural causes. The large gaps between the major groups, and occasionally you might find an intermediate stage, but then you do that with human technology too. Sometimes you can find an intermediate stage between bicycles and cars, like a motorcycle. But the point is, a completely gradual scenario just makes no sense, and it isn't supported by the fossil record. It looks like the way we humans, that's what the main point of this, it looks like the way we humans create things. If the development of life looks like the way humans, the only other known intelligent beings in the universe, design things through careful planning, testing, and improvements, why should that be taken as an argument against intelligent design? But of course, the problem is God shouldn't have done things that way. We do things that way, but God shouldn't have, we think. But we're going to discuss that in just a minute. And of course, once we get into why God did things the way he did, that's not science anymore, and we don't claim it is, but still we're interested in it. The one thing, nearly all of the evidence against intelligent design is of the form, this doesn't look like the way God should have done things. The long periods involved, the similarities between species in the same genus, but never, there's really no reasonable explanation for hardly any of it. So it may be minor changes. It's just that, this doesn't look like the way God should have done things, but it looks like the way we do things. So we're kind of in a quandary there, but we're going to discuss that in just a minute. And but one thing, if people ask me, do I believe in evolution? I don't want to say no, because they're going to think, well, you're one of those people that believe that the Earth is only 6,000 years old and it took 7 days. And if I say yes, then they'll assume that I believe in Darwinism. So I think the best answer for me, and maybe for you, is to say, I believe in the evolution of life and the evolution of automobiles, but I don't believe either could have happened without intelligent design. We talk about the evolution of automobiles, even though we know every step was designed. That evolution has several meanings, doesn't necessarily mean natural causes. We talk about the evolution of software, evolution of automobiles. We know there was intelligent design there. We're just using evolution in a more looser sense. So that, to me, that's the best answer that I can give. And it wasn't gradual even. So I don't want to just say, no, I don't believe in evolution, because, unless you're going to give me 30 minutes to explain what I mean by that, which 35 minutes already, and I'm still not there. But now we get to the really philosophical question, then we're going to get into the Bible a little bit even. But first of all, the fact is the development of life looks much like the development of human technology, but we think God shouldn't have done things that way. Well, why did he? And the study guide gives two possibilities. If you don't like one, wait for the other here. But the first reason is, explanation is the obvious answer, and that is that for the same reasons we do. But notice, I know that sounds like we're comparing God's creation to ours. We're not. I'm not comparing God's creation to ours. I'm comparing his modulus operandi, the procedure. The simplest life form is far more complex than our most advanced technology, at least in the sense that the simplest life forms can reproduce, and we still aren't close. I quoted from my new article showing why we're not close and probably never get there. We're not. God's creations are so much more advanced than ours. So I'm not comparing his creations to ours. I'm just saying that it looks like he created things use the same procedure. Going from basically simpler to more complex, although, well, there's question about that, because it's well known that 500 million years ago, most of the animal phyla appeared suddenly, and that could have been 7 days for all we know. I mean, of course, scientists don't believe that. They believe it was a couple of million years or so, but it could have been, it's possible that he did create most of the animal phyla suddenly, as far as we can tell, but still, it's like the way we do things. He didn't do everything at once, and the first explanation, again, emphasize that this isn't science anymore, and I'm sure we're going to generate a lot of discussion at the end here. It's just my opinion, but that's that's the obvious one, that God creates through testing and improvements, just like we do. In fact, some of his creations didn't make it. Again, if that sounds insulting, there's another possible explanation. But also, notice that doesn't mean that God didn't have us in mind from the beginning. I mean, humans sometimes have a goal and have a particular. They're trying to make a moon rocket, and they still do it in stages. So it doesn't mean that he didn't have us in mind from the beginning, that he created through testing improvements. But there's another possible explanation, and that's totally different. That's discussed in and this is really getting philosophical here. Basically, maybe God just didn't want to force us to believe in him. Now, I would argue that his creations are so amazing that any logical, unbiased person is forced to believe in God. But why doesn't he force everyone to? And as Jerry Coyne says, atheist, that why doesn't he sit down for an interview and remove all doubt? And he's got a good point. If God really wanted us to make sure that everyone believed, if he can create species, if he can create a universe, he could have forced everybody to believe. I believe that. And he didn't. And the question is why? And maybe, I've tried to address that at the end of my book and the epilogue, which is linked here. Let's see. So yeah, we're going to definitely go till 8 o'clock with discussion, I'm sure. But it brings up some interesting questions here. So it looks like God created similar to the way we do, step by step, but not gradually. And there's no question that it was a designer. Darwinism is rapidly falling out of disrepute, but they're still not mostly ready to accept design. Where's the... Is God really good? Okay, this is basically the last chapter in my book, and it's mostly about the problem of pain, because that's really the main reason people don't believe in God, I think, is... Oh, shoot. But it's also about the silence of God. Why doesn't he force us to believe? Let's go back here. And this is all speculation, but this is my speculation. And the last paragraph of this gives my take on why God maybe didn't want to force us to believe. So you have to read the whole epilogue to appreciate this, but I'm reading the next to last paragraph. Why does God remain backstage, hidden from view, working behind the scenes while we act out our parts in the human drama? This question has lurked just below the surface throughout much of the book, and now perhaps finally we have an answer. If he were to walk out onto the stage and take on a more direct and visible role, I suppose he could clean up our act and rid the world of pain and evil and doubt. But our human drama would be turned into a divine puppet show, and it would cost us some of our greatest blessings, the regularity of natural law, which makes our achievements meaningful, the free will, which makes us more interesting than robots, the love that we can receive from and give to others, and even the opportunity to grow and develop through suffering. I can't, this is getting very philosophical here, but basically this is the alternative. Maybe God just didn't want to force us to believe in that. Or, there's two possible explanations that I see. Maybe you can see others. We can discuss this after 7:30. But now let's see. Maybe both explanations are correct. Maybe neither one. We're just speculating. But the fact is that God's creation looks an awful lot like ours. The way he created things looks an awful lot like ours. Certainly his creations don't look like ours. Okay, well then finally, how does this fit in with Genesis 1? I've got a few comments on that here. Could be argued that this not only is this picture more consistent with the scientific evidence than the picture of a God who can create anything by snapping his fingers or waving a magic wand, without having to get involved in the details, it is perhaps also more consistent with the Genesis 1 account of creation. Genesis 1 says, on the fourth day God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. If the sun was not created until the fourth day, it is obvious that the first 3 days were not meant to be understood as days as we know them, so they could represent vast expanses of time. And after each step, God, quote, saw that it was good and proceeded to improve on his creation the next step. At the end, God rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Is snapping one's fingers or waving a magic wand work? So I'm doing a lot of speculation here. You can speculate as well as I do, but you can argue that the idea that God actually created step by step for the same reasons we do seems consistent with Genesis 1, or maybe not. By the way, the Genesis story correctly states that the universe had a definite beginning. That's the Big Bang really confirms verse 1. The sun, moon, and stars were created before life, and the sea creatures before land animals, and man was created last. Of course, we know that the Genesis story is not a scientifically accurate account of origins, but geneticist W.E. Linisch in the German TV interview discussed in section 6, we're going to look at that video with, he was the one that was 25 years at the Max Planck Institute of Plant Breeding Research, and it's a strong intelligent design supporter. Says, my personal opinion is that the Bible was much closer to the truth than the current story of chance.